Phantom frequency. Ethan Walker had always loved his grandfather's old radio. It was a relic from the 1950s, encased in polished mahogany with brass dials that clicked satisfyingly into place. After his grandfather passed away, Ethan inherited the radio, bringing it into his small apartment in the city. One evening, as rain tapped against the window, Ethan turned the dial, searching for a station. The usual static and distant voices drifted in and out, until he found something unusual. A voice clear as day, yet laced with an eerie distortion, spoke. Breaking news. A tragic accident on Greenpoint Bridge claims the life of a local teacher. The car, a red sedan, veered off the road at approximately 10:30 p.m. Ethan frowned. Greenpoint Bridge was only a few blocks away. He glanced at his watch. 10:15 p.m. Confused, he switched to his phone, searching for any reports. There were none. Thinking it was some sort of old broadcast, he turned the radio off and went to bed. The next morning, the news was everywhere. A red sedan had plunged off Greenpoint Bridge at exactly 10:30 p.m. The victim, a local teacher. A chill crept up Ethan's spine. He brushed it off as coincidence. A week later, he found the station again. A young woman, mid-20s, found dead in her apartment on 8th Avenue. Authorities suspect foul play. Time of death, approximately 2:45 a.m. Ethan's heart pounded. He looked at his clock. 2:40 a.m. The next day, the story was in the news. A woman had been found murdered in her apartment on 8th Avenue. Time of death confirmed as 2:45 a.m. Panic set in. The radio wasn't just broadcasting news, it was predicting death. Determined to prove it was all a hoax, Ethan recorded the next broadcast. This time, the voice announced a subway accident. An electrical fault will cause a fire in the underground tunnel near Lexington Station at 5:12 p.m. Casualties expected. Ethan grabbed his coat and rushed to Lexington Station, arriving just as the clock struck 5:12 p.m. Sparks exploded from the tunnel entrance, followed by a plume of smoke and panicked screams. People ran as flames flickered within the tunnel. Horrified, Ethan stumbled back. It was real. Desperate to stop the radio, he tried unplugging it, but it kept playing. Smashing it with a hammer only caused it to whisper from the broken speakers, distorting the next message. The one who knows too much must be silenced. Terror gripped Ethan. The broadcast was about him. A knock at the door. Slowly, he turned the knob. The last thing Ethan saw was the shadow of a man stepping inside, and the static of the radio swallowing his scream. Ethan awoke in a darkened room, bound to a chair. The radio sat before him on a wooden table, its dial spinning on its own. The voice returned, whispering now, more insidious. Ethan Walker, your time has come. His breath hitched as a figure loomed in the darkness. The shadow moved closer, revealing a face he recognized, his grandfather's. But his eyes were hollow, black pits, and his skin seemed stretched too tight over his bones. You should have left it alone, the thing that was his grandfather rasped. You listened too closely. Now you belong to it. Ethan struggled, but the bindings tightened on their own. The radio crackled again. A man, mid-30s, found lifeless in an abandoned building. Cause of death unknown. No signs of struggle. Tears welled in Ethan's eyes. He screamed, but the radio's static consumed his voice. The last thing he felt was a cold hand pressing against his forehead before darkness swallowed him whole. The next morning, a janitor found an empty chair in the abandoned room. The radio sat untouched, its dial stuck on an empty frequency. Somewhere in the city, a new owner found an old radio at a thrift shop. They took it home, admiring its polished mahogany and brass dials. That evening, they turned it on. The static whispered a name. The cycle began again. In a dimly lit basement on the other side of the city, Ethan gasped awake, his surroundings unfamiliar. The air was damp, the walls made of crumbling brick. He wasn't alone. Shadows lurked at the edges of the flickering light bulb overhead, whispering in voices that sounded like the radio. He tried to stand, but his body wouldn't obey. His hands were still bound, but now, so was his mouth, tightly wrapped in cloth. He struggled, muffled screams escaping into the darkness. Then, the radio crackled back to life. The missing man reappears in the depths of an abandoned basement, No exit in sight, no hope remains. The whispers around him grew louder. Faces, distorted, half-formed, emerged from the darkness, their eyes hollow voids like his grandfather's. "Join us," they murmured. "You belong to the frequency now." Ethan thrashed as the darkness enveloped him, his vision blurred, his breath shallow. The radio dial spun wildly, its voice chanting his name over and over, consuming his identity in waves of static. Then silence. Days later, a man named James entered the thrift store, browsing through old electronics. His fingers brushed against a polished mahogany radio. Intrigued, he bought it and took it home. That night, as he turned the dial, static filled the room. Then a voice, familiar but desperate, whispered, "Help me, please." James leaned in closer. The static grew louder. The cycle continued. James couldn't shake the voice from his head. It followed him, echoing in his dreams. He swore he saw shadows move whenever the radio was on. Determined to uncover the truth, he searched for any record of the device. The deeper he dug, the more missing persons reports he found, all linked to an antique radio. Then one night, the voice returned, stronger, pleading. "James, you must break the cycle before it takes you too." He hesitated, fingers hovering over the dial. Then the static surged and the whispers turned to screams. James grabbed the radio, rushing to the nearest bridge. With one final effort, he hurled it into the river. The water swallowed it whole. The static vanished. For the first time in days, silence filled his apartment. James sighed in relief until he heard a faint whisper from the unplugged speakers of his television. "You cannot escape the frequency.